When I say Los Alamos from below, I mean that. Although in my field and at the present time I'm a slightly famous man, at that time I was not anybody famous at all. I didn't even have a degree when I started to work with the Manhattan Project. Many of the other people who tell you about Los Alamos, people in higher echelons, worried about some big decisions. I worried about no big decisions. I was always flittering about underneath. I was working in my room at Princeton one day when Bob Wilson came in and said that he had been funded to do a job that was a secret and that he wasn't supposed to tell anybody, but he was going to tell me because he knew that as soon as I knew what he was going to do, I'd see that I had to go along with it. So he told me about the problem of separating different isotopes of uranium to ultimately make a bomb. He had a process for separating the isotopes of uranium, different than the one that was ultimately used, that he wanted to try to develop. He told me about it, and he said, "There's a meeting." I said I didn't want to do it. He said, "All right, there's a meeting at 3 o'clock. I'll see you there." I said, "It's all right that you told me your secret, because I'm not going to tell anybody, but I'm not going to do it." So I went back to work on my thesis for about 3 minutes. Then I began to pace the floor and thinking about this thing. The Germans had Hitler, and the possibility of developing an atomic bomb was obvious, and the possibility that they would develop it before we did was very much of a fright. So I decided to go to the meeting at 3 o'clock. By 4 o'clock, I already had a desk in a room and was trying to calculate whether this particular method was limited by the total amount of current that you can get in an ion beam, and so forth. I won't go into the details, but I had a desk and I had a paper, and I was working as hard as I could and as fast as I could, so the fellows who were building the apparatus could do the experiment right there. It was like those moving pictures where you see a piece of equipment go blub blub blub. Every time I'd look up, the thing was getting bigger. What was happening, of course, was that all the boys had decided to work on this and to stop their research in science. All science stopped during the war, except for the little bit that was done at Los Alamos. And that was not much science. It was mostly engineering. All the equipment from different research projects was being put together to make the new apparatus to do the experiment, to try to separate the isotopes of uranium. I stopped my work for the same reason, though I did take a 6-week vacation after a while and finished writing my thesis. And I did get my degree just before I got to Los Alamos, so I wasn't quite as far down the scale as I'd led you to believe. One of the first interesting experiences I had in this project at Princeton was meeting great men. I had never met very many great men before. There was an evaluation committee that had to try to help us along and help us ultimately decide which way we were going to separate the uranium. This committee had men like Compton and Tolman and Smith and Urey and Rabi and Oppenheimer on it. I would sit in because I understood the theory of how our process of separating isotopes worked, and so they'd ask me questions and talk about it. In these discussions, one man would make a point, then Compton, for example, would explain a different point of view. He would say it should be this way, and he was perfectly right. Another guy would say, well, maybe there's this other possibility we have to consider against it. So everybody is disagreeing all around the table. I am surprised and disturbed that Compton doesn't repeat and emphasize his point. Finally, at the end, Tolman, who's the chair, would say, well, having heard all these arguments, I guess it's true that Compton's argument is the best of all, and now we have to go ahead. It was such a shock to me to see that a committee of men could present a whole lot of ideas, each one thinking of a new facet, while remembering what the other fella said, so that, at the end, the decision is made which idea is the best, summing it all up without having to say it 3 times. These were very great men indeed. After the thing went off, there was tremendous excitement at Los Alamos. Everyone had parties, we all ran around. I sat on the end of a jeep and beat drums and so on. But one man, I remember, Bob Wilson, was just sitting there moping. I said, "What are you moping about?" He said, "It's a terrible thing that we made." I said, "But you started it. You got us into it." You see, what happened to me, what happened to the rest of us, is that we started for a good reason. Then you're working very hard to accomplish something and it's a pleasure. It's excitement. And you stop thinking, you just stop. Bob Wilson was the only one that was still thinking about it at that moment. I returned to civilization shortly after that and went to Cornell to teach, and my first impression was a very strange one. I can't understand it anymore, but I felt very strongly then. I sat in a restaurant in New York, for example, and I looked out at the buildings and I began to think, about how much the radius of the Hiroshima bomb damage was, and so forth. How far from here was 34th Street? All of those buildings, all smashed, and so on. And I would go along and I would see people building a bridge, or they'd be making a new road, and I thought, they're crazy. Don't they understand? Don't they understand? Why are they making new things? It's so useless. But fortunately, it's been useless for about 40 years now, hasn't it? So I've been wrong about it being useless, making bridges, and I'm glad those other people had the sense to go ahead. That was an excerpt by Richard Feynman from his essay, Los Alamos from Below.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hey there, and thank you for taking the time to listen to this, perhaps my most important, episode of Bandwidth Coast to Coast yet. At the present event that this is being released, the world looking out from my spot in the middle of North America looks and feels like absolute chaos. A chaos that further hides many of the issues which continue to surround us in the open while completely going unnoticed. One of those issues that has a high ranking on my list of eminent concern is nuclear weapons. I use the parable by David Foster Wallace in his This Is Water speech frequently as the simplest framework to view those types of problems that go completely and unknowingly unnoticed while directly occurring in front of us or even within us. Things that aren't necessarily forgotten, but never became fully aware. For the uninitiated, here's Wallace's parable again. There are two fish swimming along when an older fish swims by and says, "Morning, folks, how's the water?" The two fish swim merrily along for a bit when one goes to the other and asks, "What the fuck is water?" The point of this is the most seemingly obvious banalities are often the most important to keep in mind, or, like fish in water, we can forget the very fabric of the world around us. Like the fabric of our current world peace, where no major conflict between military powers has happened in the past 75 years. A peace that is due to one single innovation. Accept it or not, our current world peace was brokered by the use of nuclear weapons. It's certainly worth noting the massive movement to tie countries' economies together through the use of, quote, modern industry that happened between, quote, capitalist or democratic, quote, West and the communist Soviet bloc. I say, quote, capitalist because I believe we haven't experienced true capitalism until after the Soviet Union folded, but that is for a whole nother episode. The concept of tying economies together, along with the Marshall Plan, are due for a big call-out. However, none of it would have been possible had it not been built under the safety blanket provided by nuclear weapons. Suddenly, and violently, massive troop movements and all the industrial warfare introduced in World War I before being perfected in World War II became completely obsolete. For with one drop of a few hundred pounds of metal and wires, a whole city could be disintegrated in an instant. This is something that's incredibly easy to forget. For nearly all of us alive were too young to learn these lessons firsthand. Few have memories of bomb drills in schools, while the vast majority of us grew up in a world where this nuclear piece was completely taken for granted, like fish swimming in a current, completely unaware of its force. Sure, there were events like the Fukushima plant in Japan or Chernobyl before it, but neither were at the scale or intention of a nuclear bomb. Yet, dropping a nuclear weapon nearly always gets brought up as a knee-jerk reaction to any overwhelming use of force. Like we heard from Rowan on the first interview in this series, as he was walking down Lower Manhattan, first learning that the plane sticking out of the World Trade Center was done intentionally by terrorists. Learning this and hearing passerbys in the street suggesting we drop a couple eggs as the plane attacks gave us some sort of casus belli for that level of proportional response. The bomb has been a staple of the world since before the world even knew about the Manhattan Project or the signing of the first peace it brought on the USS Missouri. It was a silent race against time that, pulling from Richard Feynman again, even the scientists working on it didn't know what would really happen when they successfully pulled it off. He says in his Los Alamos essay, there were legitimate fears that the chain reaction started by the bomb would ignite the atmosphere on fire. Which brings me back to the moment this all occurred in. The fear for what new industrial horrors the war would bring were so great that the best and brightest minds dropped whatever they were working on and all got together to create the ultimate weapon. Something that the great Albert Einstein had a large hand in starting and later regretted had he known the Germans would never have created the nuclear weapon. The Einstein-Salazar letter, as it's known, encouraged FDR to race to create the bomb for fear and knowledge that the Nazis were presently working on it. Just imagine if one of those V-2 rockets bombarding London had a nuclear payload. Everything within the M25 in London would have been gone beyond recognition. That was the set and setting for the creation of the weapon, and the furthering of its development that came from a new Soviet empire and the friction with the, quote, West. The culture, economic, and military friction was there, so if a new war broke out between the powers created out of the end of the last World War, what would the world come to? What would be left of the world? So, as the zeitgeist went, the plan was to build bigger and bigger, more and more efficient and destructive weapons. For if we both had the keys to the destruction, perhaps no one would pull the trigger. It's in that iteration, not the introduction or development of it, but rather the effects and legacy of it, that this episode is focused on. As my guest, the chair of the Marshall Islands Nuclear Commission, Rhea Moss-Christian, will detail. Starting in the 1940s, the U.S. government was using the Marshall Islands as a testing ground to understand the effects and capabilities of nuclear weapons. Long before a global nonstop news cycle, when the world cultures and economies were just starting to get thrown into a connected net with one another, and well before an idea of social media was even in the fringe, an isolated group of people were experiencing the effects of modern war after peace was already brokered. People who for years upon years were thriving in communities on islands that to the uninitiated would look as an isolated vacation spot, but to them was home. The fears, uncertainties, and what-ifs that brought nuclear weapons into existence are unimaginable. What was done from there, though, is known, documented, and felt by the souls living on those islands. We've all become familiar with the idea of an arms race, stacking up enough don't fuck with any weapons so the other side builds more of their own, creating a cycle that thus ensures by proxy that the weapons are never used. What we've not become familiar with is what effects that has outside of the idea of that race. What happens in reality when the don't fuck with any weapons are atomic reactions. Mutual destruction ensured a world without major conflict. That's a truth, just as much as it was a complete chance. How, though, was that mutual destruction perfected and improved? We will hear in this episode what debt we owe to the civilian people of the Marshall Islands for a choice that wasn't their own, but effects they've had to endure nonetheless. Effects of having your family removed from their homes before it's wiped off the map in a sudden fiery flash, or mistaking nuclear fallout for snow and having to want your children to live with that honest mistake. The legacy of these tests isn't far out from our culture. Just like fish swimming in water, it's been obviously hiding right in front of us. In many things I'm sure you've seen. From shifting the narrative a bit for the Matthew Broderick Godzilla movie in the 90s, where the nuclear radiation gives birth to a new skyscraper-sized species of lizard, or in the 2016 movie on Netflix, Hail Caesar, where Lockheed Martin exec joyfully explains the latest nuclear explosion and the financial opportunity of getting into the arms industry in the 50s, or for an all-ages example, Bikini Bottom Bay in the infamous cartoon SpongeBob SquarePants, which is set on the Bikini Atoll, with its characters being the mutant creatures altered by the radiation from the nuclear tests, as well as numerous other examples from pop culture that I've collected. It's been hiding, in plain sight, is nothing more than a banal mushroom cloud and made near aesthetic with the memory it manufactures. What I hope this episode provides is more than images of explosions and the twice removed concept we get from these tests when they're filtered through a scientific, historical, or pop perspective. But instead, the human stories of those affected. Those who never so much as saw someone without melanin in their skin, to then have shipfuls of white people coming ashore telling them to not eat their food or drink their water days after the radiation fell and already started taking its toll. I struggle with making this intro long, short, not having one, or putting this as a standalone thought. After much deliberation and consulting, I've decided to keep this in the hopes of giving all those alive to hear more perspective on the nuclear legacy we've unknowingly inherited. Thank you to all the Marshallese people for the history you've had to endure, the diaspora, social, and health costs emerging from it, and the untaught, indispensable hand you've played in giving the world a safety net to come together as one peaceful species, which paved the way for me to have this interview across the whole Pacific and a day away. And a special thanks to my guest, Rhea Moss-Christian, for taking the time to talk with me, sharing her family's story, and giving me more perspective on how to live a good life. I appreciate your listen, and I'm wishing you well. Real quick before the episode starts, if you'd like to find us on your social media platform of choice, sign up for our mailing list to be the first to know about episode drops, know about upcoming guests or opportunities to ask questions and provide suggestions, please visit us at bandwidthpodcast.com. And of course, if you like what you hear, please follow, comment, or subscribe to the pod, however it is that this is getting to your ears. All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me. I'm not excited to talk about this topic only because it's one that is sad and heavy, but I'm very excited to talk with you and to learn about it. And thank you very much for taking the time. So we have it, and we're going to kind of get kicked off in a second. Would you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Rhea Moss-Christian, and I am the chair of the Marshall Islands National Nuclear Commission. This is a commission that was established by the government in 2017 to address outstanding impacts of the U.S. nuclear weapons testing program in the Marshall Islands.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it was such a young group.
It's a young organization or a young entity, but there has been decades of efforts before this entity was established. So this is probably I wouldn't say the first, the second formal national effort toward addressing impacts. There have been ongoing efforts by local governments, the island governments for the islands that were most affected, individuals. That's been going on since the 50s, since even before the testing finished.
That's interesting. I want to dive into that, but before we do that, I'm going to take an adjacent step, and I want to get to know you like a little bit more. And I always ask the first time, and I hope you come on more, but for the first time that someone's a guest, I like to ask the same question, which is, what do you like to do that makes you happy?
I don't know why that's always such a hard question to answer. I feel like most days I'm fairly content, but I don't think it's from doing anything particularly interesting or exciting.
Just the way you live your life,
Yeah,
which I guess is great in itself, right?
yeah, and I think what that's telling me is that I'm pretty lucky because, like I said, I think most days I'm feeling fairly content, and it's just working from home and raising my 6-year-old daughter and spending time with family, which is probably a common answer for most, I would think.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot we can all learn from that. Just contentment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny. I ask that question a lot, and the spectrum of answers I get is always interesting. And one of them I always go back to is a historian who said there's no such thing as happiness, and I just try to be content. So I think your answer is actually very close to his.
I am practical to a fault.
Nothing wrong with that, as long as you balance it enough with irrationality occasionally.
Occasionally.
Yes. Okay, so in 2018, so just so you know, I'm a bit of a nut when it comes to nuclear weapons. I study it quite a lot. One of the people I study a lot is Richard Feynman, and he worked on the Manhattan Project. And he's kind of, after reading one of his books, I've kind of kept a log on all nuclear news, because he has a story in one of his books where he explains the first test in Nevada that was successful, and how there was one individual that was standing off to the side and everyone else was cheering, and this guy looked like he had a blank stare. And he asked, "Why do you have such a blank stare? Why aren't you cheering?" And he goes, "We were so wrapped up in what we were doing. I don't know what we just accomplished." And that always stuck with me. So ever since then, I kind of always have kept in the news of, arms agreements or disagreements or dissolvings, and things like that. So in 2018, when I came across an article in the LA Times about the Runit Dome in the Marshall Islands, I took a particular interest in it. So would you mind just kind of very briefly introduce to us the Runit Dome, and then I want to go backwards in time from there and talk about the testing and then how that even got there in the first place. And I think we're going to actually end up coming back to Nevada and that first test site again too.
Okay. Well, the Runit Dome is a facility. It is a physical facility that sits on Runit Island in Eniwetok Atoll in the northern Marshall Islands. So Runit Dome is more of a nickname, but obviously not in an endearing way. It is in fact a low-level nuclear waste facility, if we're being technical. Eniwetok Atoll was the site of 43 atmospheric nuclear tests. They experienced the bulk of the tests that were conducted in the Marshall Islands. So in the 70s, the US government was looking to clean up some of these atolls, and cleanup has to be taken very loosely because you can't really clean up radiation. So it was an effort to, I guess, make the island safe for communities. But even safe is a relative term as well. So the US brought in military vets or military personnel and contractors from Department of Energy. There was a multi-agency effort to scrape the topsoil off of Runit Island, and some of the islets around there, and contain them in this dome, this concrete dome. When they constructed the dome, they didn't line the crater. There was a crater from one of the bomb tests, but they didn't line it. And there was a lot of debris. The structure, if you look at the diagrams, the structure that are available in Department of Defense documents and Atomic Energy Commission documents, you see several layers under this dome, where the bottom layers which are at coastal tide, they're at groundwater level, ground level, sea level, are mainly debris and maybe some equipment that's not supposedly doesn't contain any radiations or toxins. And then as you go up the levels of this dome, the top layer of the dome is where the radiation or radioactive equipment is placed. And then the dome was capped off with this concrete. According to the Department of Energy, there's less than 1% of plutonium in the dome, which means that more than 99% of the plutonium is outside the dome, which calls into question the whole idea of cleaning up the islands or making them safe. So here sits this unlined, concrete-covered dome at sea level, at the edge of an island that is prone to high tide events, extreme weather events, and with plutonium inside. The Runit Dome for us is kind of it's the physical symbol, right? It's a physical symbol of what's left behind by the nuclear testing. And what we have to remember is that yes, it's problematic. This is a low-level nuclear waste facility. What does this mean for the community that's living nearby in Inuiatak Atoll? What does this mean for the marine life adjacent in the lagoon to the dome? What does this mean if there's extreme weather events, climate change, sea level rise? What does all of this mean? But also, what about everything that's still outside the dome and all the plutonium that's sitting in the sediment in the lagoon and buried in crypts around the island, which is information that we're just starting to learn and is generating more questions for us, and other radionuclides that are still in existence on that island. And we're also learning that there's potential contamination there of beryllium, which is a much more dangerous toxin than plutonium. So you have this situation where you've got all of these toxins and radionuclides that are just sitting out there on this isolated island, on an isolated atoll, right there at sea level, and there's very little protection. Actually, there's no protection. There's no fence around the island. There's no security. If you compare this to Hanford, for example, the nuclear facility in Washington, Hanford has incredible security, armed guards, I believe, and fences around this facility to keep people out, but to keep people safe. And then you have the Runit Dome, which is at the other extreme of the spectrum of safety. Every time I'm saying safety, I'm putting air quotes because it's just, I don't think you can ever expect full safety. It'll never be restored to what it was. But that's how Runit Dome got there. So that was constructed in the late 70s and completed around 1980, and then left. So there it sits.
Wow. That's a stark picture. I can definitely see imperial scars. That's what I've been like obsessing about and prepping for this, is the scar that this dome has to have leave, and being able to kind of see it. And especially seeing that. So if I'm hearing you right, 99% of the actual radiation that is caused by these 43 atmospheric detonations is not being contained in the dome. So 99% of the most radioactive pieces of this is not actually even being contained inside this concrete. Is that right?
That is according to DOE's research and reports that, yeah, most of the plutonium is outside the dome in the lagoon primarily, and likely in the sediment in the lagoon floor.
So just in shallow water right there in the outside of the island. So what were these atmospheric detonations? When did they start, and what kind of were they?
So the testing started in 1946, and The last test was in 1958. There were 67 total. So let me see, I'll give you some stats to kind of put things into perspective. 23 of the tests were on Bikini Atoll, 43 were at Enewetak Atoll, plus one failed test, but that failed test still resulted in a lot of fallout and contamination. The 67 tests were equivalent to 108 megatons total yield, which is the equivalent yield of more than 7,000 Hiroshima bombs. 93 times the total of Nevada atmospheric tests, and the equivalent yield of 1.6 Hiroshima-sized bombs fired every day for 12 years in the Marshall Islands.
Wow.
So just to give you an idea of scale.
Yeah, that is huge. So this was, and how many years was this the course of? So it was 1946, and was this over the course of just a few years, or was this over the course of a decade?
Until 1958, so about 12 years or so.
Wow. Okay. I'm kind of at a loss for words with that. How close are people living to these islands? Were there people living on I'm assuming, I actually know this from researching, some people were actually forcibly moved in order to do testing, right? And then what was the closest kind of major settlement to these, and were they experiencing effects of it in that 12-year period, or is it kind of taken time?
Oh, so yes. So the Bikini Atoll community was relocated, and the Enewetak Atoll community was also relocated. But the nearby communities were within several hundred miles. They weren't relocated. So included in that test series was the infamous Bravo shot, which was the largest hydrogen bomb tested by the US, equivalent to 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. For that test, that was in 1954, the fallout from that test rained over neighboring atolls, Rongelap, Utrecht, and others. But this is where we start to diverge with the US account of who was actually affected by the testing. So Rongelap and Utrecht communities are known as sort of the downwinders who experienced the fallout from that massive hydrogen bomb test. And they were not relocated before that test. There are different accounts of whether the US knew that the winds had shifted and would be carrying that fallout toward populated islands. I think it depends on who you talk to. The documents are there. Most of those documents are declassified. But following that test, a project came up known as Project 4.1 that was essentially human radiation studies. And the people from Rongelap became part of what were called medical studies by the US to understand the impacts of the radiation fallout on their bodies. Except that the testing or the studies were being done by Brookhaven National Laboratory, not a hospital. Physicians for sure, but intuitively you have to ask yourself, why is a laboratory, a weapons laboratory, radiation lab doing medical examinations and medical monitoring? So Project 4.1 is kind of a different story, but that's another piece of the nuclear history. So there's the bomb tests where people had to be relocated and remain dislocated from their islands. And then there's the communities that experienced the fallout, but were not relocated and are still experiencing the health effects. Some of the islands, the declassified documents show that other islands experienced some level of fallout as well, but they were not evacuated. There's another northern atoll called Ailuk, where my mother grew up. And she was 10 years old when the 1954 bomb test took place. And she passed away. She passed away from stomach cancer almost 9 years ago now. And
Sorry for your loss.
thank you. And she told us stories growing up and about how she remembered when the US Navy ship came ashore, and it was the first time that she'd seen a white man, and she was scared. And she remembered hearing the blast and everybody running into the center of the island, and then the ship coming ashore a couple of days later and telling everyone not to eat the coconuts or the breadfruit or drink the rainwater for a little while. I don't know how much information they were given. She was 10 years old, so it was her 10-year-old memory sharing those stories with us. But this was a population that was not relocated before that test, but most definitely experienced fallout. And it's not the only one. There are other northern atolls in that area who have stories and accounts of illnesses that were unheard of before then.
Wow. So your mother is 10 years old. There's an explosion. So I actually was looking at pictures, and some of these people in communities that were not that far away would have been able to see and feel that explosion as it goes off. And then somebody comes ashore several days later, which I think is tragically ironic, and says, don't eat the coconuts and drink the rainwater that you've been doing for the several days since that explosion. And I mean, don't take this as me undercutting anybody or trying to rationalize anything, but the American government didn't have that great of an understanding of what nuclear fallout would do. They had a way better understanding of what it would do than the people that were experiencing it, though. So this is obviously the first of what I'm thinking I'm going to find many examples of them grossly not handling the situation in which they were creating. Wow. Okay, I want to take like a couple years back in time from when it started in 1946. So, and I want to ask this question broadly, but take it whichever direction you want to go with, which is, how did the U.S. get the ability to be detonating bombs in the Marshall Islands, which for anyone who's listening, I encourage you to go to Google Maps or whichever OpenStreetMaps, actually, I would encourage you to go to, and take a look at where the Marshall Islands are, which is they're in the Pacific, slightly northeast of Australia, just generally speaking. So how did the U.S. come to be able to do this and get away with it? Well, get away with it, I think, is a question I'm gonna hold that one. How did the U.S. get to the position to be able to have this territory of land that they're exploding and relocating people, and then coming in a few days later?
Following the end of World War II, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Palau, we all became trust territories of the United States. So we were under the UN Trusteeship Council. The US became the new administrator for these islands following the end of the war. The trusteeship, that was supposed to be a time where, with the US as a new administrator, to look after the well-being and the safety. Instead they look at the islands as a testing ground. And so the testing began shortly after that. Your knowledge and details of the initial testing in the US is probably sharper than mine, but that's, testing in the US is one thing, right? You can think of the political ramifications there and just all the factors that are gonna go into whether or not you want to continue doing that in your own backyard, or you're going to take it somewhere else, to someone else's backyard, even though it is technically the US backyard as an administrator of these islands and under the trusteeship. But now this backyard is very isolated, far away, and relatively unknown to the rest of the world. No question our islands are isolated. No question up in the north that there's not a lot. We're far away from other major populations. And so yeah, you can kind of see the decision of how the decision makers come to this conclusion that this is the best place to go and test atmospheric weapons. We're out in the middle of nowhere. There were petitions. Marshallese petitioned the UN around that time to, after the first several bomb tests, to have these tests stopped unsuccessfully, and the testing continued. But at the time, we were not self-governing. The U.S. had full control of these islands. It was the Cold War. Your question, how did they get away with it? Well, I think there are lots of reasons, and there are probably lots of arguments you can make how they got away with it. But in the middle of the Cold War era, after the end of a brutal world war, what can you do as a small island population, who's largely been pawns up until that point? Before the U.S. was there, the Japanese were there, and then the Germans and the Spanish. And so we have a long history of Western powers and Western rule coming in and dictating what happens in our islands. The nuclear tests was just another era of the same.
Yeah, imperial scars. That's what I keep thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I know a bit about the nuclear testing in the U.S. and I know they did it in Las Vegas, or not in Las Vegas. They did it in central Nevada, actually. And the reason for that was because it was the easiest to hide from the rest of the world as to what was happening. And one of the interesting things that Richard Feynman gets into is they didn't know if the first test that they did that was successful, if it was going to set the atmosphere on fire. Mm-hmm. So they legitimately didn't know if they were going to cause a catastrophic event that would strikingly alter the entire of the Earth. So, I asked it almost, in rhetorically, way, because it's obvious that they would choose somewhere that was in the middle of. So when I asked you, I remember asking you this when we first started corresponding, and I said, "Can you tell me what island you're on? Because I'm curious to see where it is." And I had such amount of unease seeing that you were just this little dot in the middle of nowhere, and someone's from the Midwest where everything's flat and just the Earth is an ocean in every direction. I got very uneasy thinking about being thousands of miles away from anywhere else and just having ocean, which living on the coast, I can tell you the ocean is not to be toyed with. So, it makes sense that in an era where, at the end of World War II, everyone thought the U.S. was just going to keep going. They thought they were going to keep going east and they were going to, become the next imperial power. And in a lot of the ways they did, but they did it in a way that everyone was kind of surprised. And to your point, everyone was exhausted from what was happening for, decades at that point. So, choosing a spot that's far off in the middle of, the ocean and, with the people that aren't connected to the rest of the world in this way that everyone else is. There wasn't a way to telegram the, USA Today or the New York Times and say, this is what's happening. So, it's almost like it was an information blackout there. So that makes, it's an unfortunate event that makes sense why they would choose that to try to do that. But the other part of it that makes me, I'm going to try to check my furiousness right now. Furiosity, I'm not sure how to conjugate that. Is, like the first initial tests, they really, even when they dropped the bomb on, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they didn't necessarily know what that was going to do. So then to ramp it up to the level of 1,000, what that one was, what Fat Boy was, is quite startling, especially to do it in an area of an ocean, which I want to get into with you is, radiation that we know from Chernobyl went around the world, right? And radiation in an ocean with jet streams affects large swaths of ecosystems and all types of life that go in there. So that's rather startling to hear. Okay, so the U.S. kind of comes into governance of these atolls and these islands. And within a year of doing that, they start testing on there, and they start relocating people. And this went on for 12 years which is astounding. When did was there ever at any point, other than having this project 4.1, which I want to ask a couple more questions on. So was there ever anything outside of that trying to provide any type of assistance to either, straight up the diet, like the coconuts being affected? I mean, that's not a small thing to be affected, like your food supplies, your fresh water supplies. Was there any effort within those 12 years or without those 12 years, other than having, a bunch of scientists, not doctors, come in and kind of understand the effects? Was there ever anything?
Not necessarily. So it's sort of like an accumulation of knowledge over time, because Marshallese weren't the only ones who were affected by the tests. The US also exposed its own military personnel to the tests. I think that there were no question that I think everyone knew these were going to be destructive and harmful. I think the extent and the degree is what was unknown. And I think this is where we start to maybe get into opining a bit, and as a Marshallese, I'm half Marshallese and I'm half American. And I studied this history. I studied my Marshallese history a little bit in college, but I grew up learning about it from my mom. But there are times when I'm like you, I'm furious. I'm thinking, how are we even dealing with this situation still? And then in times I have a very rational mind and I think, well, I kind of see where, you've got this major world military power looking to try learn more about how much power they actually have and potentially deter a third world war and other rising powers. I get all that. And I think that's more of my intellectual mind because I studied politics, but or international politics, but it's like, so sorry, I'm trying to gather my thoughts because there's so many different directions you can go in this discussion. But people were relocated and then they were brought back at certain points because the US thought the islands were safe enough, and then they were removed again. But people were also relocated to islands where they basically couldn't survive and famines occurred. I mean, there was so much about this that was in a lot of ways trial and error. And the Marshallese were really at the whim of the US and trusting the US to do what was best for them. So relocating them to safe places where they could survive. And we know so much more now, of course, but at the time, if you can imagine yourself in this situation where you don't have any idea what you're agreeing to be relocated, you're trusting this new administrator that they're going to take care of you and then, you'll temporarily go live somewhere else and come back. I mean, I really think the US believed that too, to some degree. I don't think they were fully honest and genuine about what could potentially go wrong or could potentially happen. But I do think there was probably some level of faith that, we could probably come back to this. We could restore things. We can come back. That was a time of discovery, a great scientific discovery. There was a lot of experimenting going on. This is essentially experiments. But then when you start, you can understand that maybe on an intellectual level, right? You just take the human element out of it a little bit, and you think purely scientific and military power. That's one realm. But then you go into the human part, and that's the part where we have to stay. We have to stay there because people continue to be affected. I mean, these were real people. These are my family members, my mother and her family on this island, and my colleagues on the other islands, and people who, through generations, this next generation, we don't know for sure the generational impact, But for sure, there is a long-term health impact to being removed from your land, where your life is based in subsistence lifestyle, where you're farming and growing your food and living off the land, to a lifestyle where everything you're eating is imported. And you know that that's not a very good diet when you're depending on imported food. And a lot of those displaced communities are now receiving food aid from USDA. And their lifestyles have changed as a result. Taste buds change. I mean, these things evolve naturally anyways. But when it's sort of forced upon you because of this kind of tragic reason, it just makes the whole thing that much more devastating. And it's harder to combat. So the issues that we're dealing with now, it's not only contaminated islands that remain unsafe for habitation, where people can't go back. And, you know, in Marshallese culture, we're connected to our land. Our identity comes from our land. When you don't have land, you don't have self, you know, sense of self. Where's your place? So when you're removed from your land, that's one form of violence that occurs from this experience. And then the second form is what happens to your health. And that is generational for sure. So we have high cancer rates, diabetes, all kinds of lifestyle associated illnesses that I think you can trace to this nuclear history and this nuclear legacy. Of course, we understand that as you know, the world becomes more interconnected, as we, you know, become more globalized and people learn more and they're more educated and they move around more, yes, things are going to change. Your culture is going to change, it's going to evolve, your lifestyle, yes, all of that. But there is this element in the Marshall Islands that is very much linked to nuclear testing and in some ways, maybe the rapid forcing of these changes or the undue influence of these changes on these changes that are irreversible. In the Nuclear Commission, one of our highest priorities is healthcare and addressing healthcare needs. There is no cancer care in the Marshall Islands. So if you get cancer, you have to be referred overseas. So there's additional displacement. So now you're removed again from your community and your family, who you need the most when you're going through any kind of medical treatment. And now you have to be sent overseas to have treatment. Maybe not all cancers are attributed to radiation. I'm not suggesting that necessarily, but we definitely have high incidences of cancer that are linked to the nuclear testing.
I don't know what the metric or yardstick is for rates of cancer, but how high is your rates of cancer versus a statistical norm?
And that is a number I don't have off the top of my head for you.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's quite all right. I want to go back to that. Some of the things you said of understanding the duality of both what the U.S. was doing and what, you know, was inflicted upon the Marshallese. I definitely sympathize with the way that you were pointing those dualities of one, you know, you have a new superpower that unlocked a godlike power to destroy in an instant, and didn't know what exactly that came with it, while at the same time realizing that there was, you know, almost 40 years of suffering at that point, right? Because I mean, World War I and World War II are almost just like one big, long, drawn out play. And then just the sheer acts of horror and the scale of industrial combat and war just kind of ramped everything up, right? So I definitely can sympathize with that intellectual stance, but I think it was a lot of willful ignorance on the part of the U.S. to say, you know, we understand there's going to be some issues here, but where else are we going to go, maybe, right? Or something along those lines. I think they had to have had some understanding of it. just from the scientists going into Hiroshima, after the armistice alone, would lead me to believe that. But there's a lot of words I kind of like a lot, and one of them is conundrum, and I think what this is a very big conundrum, because we can understand the history that got there, but I think the biggest point of it is, in globalization, which is really what you were describing there, right? Like, you can get globalized by having the Beastie Boys play on your radio and a McDonald's go up down the street, right? That's kind of like a soft, globalization. And, over time, the culture will adjust from, whatever it is that you're wearing to maybe blue jeans and, whatever else, right? Kind of that American globalization, because like it or not, the biggest thing that America exports is culture. And that's a fact. So, in this interconnected world and, capital flowing, you can get globalized that way, right? Or you can get globalized in a way of, we just had 4 decades of war, and in the Marshallese case, umpteen decades of, the U.S. called it stewardship, but it was imperial control, right? Like, it was, one imperial power over the other. And frankly speaking, the Marshall Islands don't have very many resources, but it's a very good place to stop and refuel and then keep going, right? So it was strategic for them to have these other imperial powers. So I can understand that the part of the Marshallese to say, like, I'm going to, you said it, that they trusted America. I can understand why they would, because you have this zeitgeist of America could have kept rolling and they decided not to. We've had all of these problems and suffering and further conundrums of what a Japanese imperial legacy was, or a Spanish before that, to say, okay, sure, we will relocate from an area that we have lived for eons, and trust that it's okay. But unknowingly, in doing so, you're actually signing the lease to be able to never go back there again for eons again. And I think that that's important, because I think it's important. I struggle with if anybody should have the right to a nuclear weapon, to be honest, because I think it is such an immense amount of power. I fundamentally disagree with the fact that we have evolved to a point to be able to have that power. I don't think that we have in any way. So I struggle with that. But to then say, we're going to test in this certain area to see what exactly it is, and take out of the equation, what is that going to do for the legacy of individuals that were there, and what suffering are we leaving behind? I think is an awful amount of willful ignorance, which, to your point, perhaps that was also the age they lived in because of the general scientific explosion. Like 1938 to 1945 was an incredible span of technology that, maybe it's only a second to what we're going to see in the next couple of years with genetics. But yeah, that's a hell of a scar to have there. So you okay? So you said 12 years of testing, and people relocated. How was there effects from these during that time period? Were people starting to see effects from it? Like, I know you said that Project 4.1 was happening during this, but was it something that, outside of like the abject, okay, so even in the example of people being relocated and then being told, oh, sorry, you got to go back again, were the Marshallese starting to get wise to the fact that that the U.S. is not to be trusted?
Oh yeah, we have, our history activists, Marshallese activists. Like I said, there were petitions to the United Nations by certain Marshallese individuals to stop the testing before 1958. This is where I start to feel a bit uncomfortable talking about, because the health impacts that people experienced, and particularly women and reproductive health, are they're horrific. And they're really personal stories. And some of these women have shared them globally. They've traveled the world and spoken to international audiences, trying to appeal to the greater moral good of the international community in the United States. These stories have been told in front of US Congress. They're just incredibly sad, the impacts on reproductive health for women in particular, the birth of deformed babies, multiple miscarriages, health effects that were never seen before. So these start happening fairly soon after the testing is finished. But the response seems to be just more studies, more medical studies, more scientific studies, but no real care, no real medical care. And I think this is a time when people there's so much that's scary and new. And I think anyone would feel this way now if something's scary and new. You don't know if the way you're being treated for that is the right way. Oftentimes you don't realize it till later. I think that's true even now for a lot of our health system and some of the ways that our illnesses or conditions are treated. You don't know things. You're not a doctor. You trust the doctor. So, yeah, I think people were feeling these impacts and they were just being studied more and documented, but I don't think people were getting the care they needed. And I think this is systemic in the US healthcare system anyways, where the illness is treated kind of in isolation of the person. So you don't have that holistic, that whole body or that whole person, your mind, your body, everything's connected. You don't get that kind of medical care. It's pretty rare if you do. I'm not suggesting that it's like that everywhere, but I think that was kind of how it was for a lot of Marshallese that were experiencing this. And then you had language barriers, you had cultural barriers. So you just had so many things factoring into this just poorly handled after effect of the testing on human life.
So it was. Go ahead. Yeah, keep going. It was obviously very seen and viscerally felt while this was happening.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when that Bravo shot, when the fallout was raining down on the people on Rongelap, there are stark photos. You might have seen these photos. They're just of children with burned skin. And, the accounts told by those people are that they thought it was snow. They didn't know. They weren't warned. So, yeah, they're feeling the effects immediately in that case. And then the studies begin. But there's very little information that's being shared about what's happening with these people, what's happening to their bodies.
Yeah, and there was no Twitter to be able to all of a sudden broadcast to the world some pretty stark images and hope that they don't diminish it in the algorithm or something.
But like I said, it's not like you go get a second opinion. It's not like you have any other information on your own to question what's being done. You just, you're just trusting the authorities, in this case, the medical authorities, scientific authorities, the US authorities, to have your best interests in mind when they're checking your skin or your body for illness. I can't even begin to imagine what that was like for people. And that's why I start to feel a bit uncomfortable talking about it, because it is such an intensely personal experience, I'm sure. And I don't want my talking about it to diminish or lessen the impact that had on so many people.
I appreciate you talking about it nonetheless. I understand that you don't want to take somebody's individual suffering and put it into a number or a statistic, and I understand that. I appreciate you laying that out in either case, though. When I was on a walk shortly after I saw that where your island was and how remote in the ocean it was, what came to me was I went on a dive a few years ago into Polynesian culture, and some of the things they did with like mapping out currents and wind patterns and some of these like maps, these like stick maps that they do, and it's quite amazing. And what it brought to me back when I was thinking about where you live is such an appreciation for the fact that people were able to find these islands and live on them for eons, and not just live but thrive, right? Which is really amazing. And I think that's something not to get lost in all of this, because if a baby was born in any other time before this, the people the Marshallese people would have been able to figure out how to raise that baby quite well. So when they're struck with something, and there's just no questions, or there's all there is questions, right? There's no answers, like some of the ways in which you were describing. I couldn't imagine the amount of fear and uncertainty and trauma that would cause, because I mean, you go from never seeing somebody of another race before, which to us is something that I'm not sure many people even think of, right? And like that was a real thing that was starting to happen at this time, right? Like the 40s into the 50s was the time of, we now look back upon it as if it was like this dandy time. But really, it was this time of shock where the world was like, nope, we're going to have a literal photograph on everything, and you're going to see how everything is. And it was really like the true age of National Geographic in a way, right? Where it's like, you're going to see what these other, areas are, and we're going to come butting up against all of this, right? So to go from, a situation where, you're feeling a little ill, and your people have an understanding of the region in which you live, which once again, it didn't just extend to the land, it extended into the ocean, and how to, harvest, anything that you would need from there, and being able to understand how to treat an illness with that, and have everything that you would need on these atolls and these small islands, to then going to it feeling and looking like a sun exploded a few hundred miles away from you, and it's raining something that you think is snow, which you've never seen before. And naively thinking it's snow, and then naively having it hurt you, but you don't have any other choice but to be naive, because your trust is put into a power greater than your own. Is a view that I appreciate you still, despite being uncomfortable, expounded upon, because I think it's important to understand that.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunate that it was known about and then continued. When it stopped, was there any indication as to why it stopped, or did it just stop because some bureaucrat or team of bureaucrats had accepted this as the logical ending point, or did it just was there some type of movement and activism that got the testing to stop, or did it just kind of stop one day, and then what would that be, 20 or 18 years later, all of a sudden they build a dome?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. I don't know that I've ever checked into reasons why testing stopped. The last test was in August 1958, I believe. I'm not sure I know exactly if there was a specific event or what decision. Testing continued. I mean, the US continued to test nuclear weapons. It just stopped in the Marshall Islands.
That's okay. That's okay.
I'm going to follow up on that one. That's not something we've ever really discussed too much when we've talked about the legacy. Is we all know when it started and sort of why, but not really why it ended.
So as this is going on in this, 12 years, the first 12 years of, okay, actually, let me start in the present day. Presently, is just to kind of give the listeners a basic basis of understanding, is the Marshallese and the Marshall Islands their own, are they self-sovereign?
Yeah, we are an independent country. We have our own passports. We use the US dollar, and we're in what's called a Compact of Free Association with US, which allows immigration privileges for Marshallese living and working in the United States.
Okay, thank you for setting that up. So that's kind of where the diaspora that I'm taking it goes. So to kind of go back to what I was saying, going from a situation where you have everything at your disposal that you know how to treat whatever illnesses may happen, to now being in a situation where you have new, at least a higher degree of new illnesses that you didn't have before, and you have to actually leave the islands in order to get treatment. Because, like I said, I can understand that there um, may not be all the services that you would need there, so you have to leave. So is that where most people go when they need treatment? Let's just say for cancer or any number of other things.
Yes, mostly to the US, but also to the Philippines. But under our compact with the US, there was a special program, two different medical programs set up for communities that were affected by the nuclear testing program. So this is another term I'm going to use loosely, affected, because all of the Marshall Islands was affected. But the response from the US has limited that those communities to those from the 4 northern atolls. What's a term? It's a political construct called the 4 atolls, which is Bikini Atoll, where the test took place, Rongelap and Utrecht, where the fallout occurred. So these are the limitations of the US recognition and acknowledgement of affected communities by the nuclear testing program. We don't agree with that in the Marshall Islands, so I just want to make that point. But that's the context for the programs that we have now for medical assistance for those provided for radiation-related illnesses. So in the compact, section 177 is the nuclear section, and it sets up a health program for people from those 4 atolls with a separate budget to have kind of separate medical care. The program operates within the hospital back in Madro, but it's sort of, it's administered differently because it's directly with, it stems directly from this section 177 radiation impact provision of the compact. And then there's the DOE medical monitoring program, which is for the people from Rongelap and Utrecht who experienced the Bravo test fallout. So you have these 2 separate medical programs provided by the US in response to radiation impacts for these very specific communities. And the DOE medical program operates out of Hawaii. The patients go there. 177 is more like a clinic where they have their own funding for medical supplies and things. All cancer patients are referred from through the hospital at home, either to the Philippines. If you're in one of these programs, you're probably going to go to the US for treatment. But the referral decisions, I'm not sure exactly how they're made. A lot of people go to the US, but a lot of people will go to the US also just because they also already have family there. So you see the pattern of communities where people go and get healthcare where there's communities so they can be near, families and things like that. So that's the situation now. And one of our goals in the Nuclear Commission long-term is to establish that national cancer care so that people can be home with their families and not further dislocated. It'll be a massive undertaking because, cancer treatment, everything that comes with it is just incredibly involved and requires a lot of infrastructure that'll take a lot for us to develop.
Yeah, I'm rooting for you all, in more ways than one. So you made a mention earlier that you said there's a point. So you said there's a point in the narrative where there's a divergence from the accounts of the American and from the Marshallese. Is that part of it? Is the designation of the 4 atolls and the fallout part of it? Where, if I'm summarizing this correctly, the U.S. government's stance is that only these four atolls, or this one region that they've kind of drawing a line over are all that's affected, where the Marshallese stance is, hey there, buddy, it's all of the chains.
Yeah, it's a narrative. It's a political narrative. And it's difficult to challenge, partly because a lot of that's been internalized in the Marshall Islands too. And
How so?
we have had well, if you're from the four atoll communities, I have to choose my words carefully. So, and you're, and you have access to these special programs, and you have certain claims with the tribunal, which we can talk about later too. No question, these islands experienced the brunt of the fallout or the impact. No question whatsoever. But focusing on them in the way that the U.S. has, that a lot of Marshallese have agreed with, has erased the experiences and the impacts that people on other islands in the Marshall Islands have also felt. Like my mother's, for example, and others. And, we're kind of calling that group the mid-range atolls. And they're part of our effort now in discussions with the US, which we can also talk about a little bit later as well. But the nationwide radiological study that we had done in the late 90s definitely showed that all of the Marshall Islands experienced some level of radiation. Definitely the southern atolls had less than in the north, no question. And that's scientific data to show that. But I think if we're going to be truthful and honest about our legacy, we have to recognize that the testing impacted the entire country, which also means that it probably impacted most of the region. Guam continues to fight for compensation for itself based on the testing that took place in the Marshall Islands. I don't think these are wild claims. I think there's scientific basis here, but we're dealing with a massive amount of information in declassified documents and information that's still not declassified. There's still a lot of classified information too. And a political narrative that has taken hold for many years about the extent of the impact, not only geographically, but also in terms of health and in the environment.
So
these are the narratives that we're fighting against, or that we're working against.
Yeah. So yeah, I can imagine the conundrum that is with this imaginary political line creating a real rift within communities of who has access to care, and throughout from that. Yeah, that's very tenuous. I can understand that. That's got to be tough. So the U.S., when did they take that stance of admitting at least that those four atolls, and kind of when did that compact come into place?
The compact was signed in 1986. So that would have been a period leading up to that in negotiations. And those four atolls, the limitation of impact to four atolls is enshrined in the compact. Should we talk about the compact now?
Let's do that now, yeah.
So in that section 177, there's a provision, there was an agreement that was developed based on that section 177 to operationalize it. And that's the health program and the establishment of the Nuclear Claims Tribunal, and a provision in there known as changed circumstances, which gave the Marshall Islands an opportunity to come back to the US to request additional funding should there be a determination of changed circumstances based on new information or any new findings. So in 2000, the Marshall Islands submitted a changed circumstances petition to Congress. That would be the first national effort to address the testing that I mentioned in the beginning, with the Nuclear Commission kind of being the second. But that changed circumstances petition was submitted to Congress in 2000, and then it sat. And Congress asked, it was a very strong petition. It laid out all of the data. It made a very strong case for how we know so much more now than we did at the time in the 1980s when we agreed to this, that suggests that actually what we agreed to in the 1980s was wrong. Manifestly inadequate is the term we use often in terms of the funding for the tribunal and also the known health impacts. So Congress requested the administration to provide a response, which it did in 2005, rejecting all the claims of changed circumstances. And then that was it.
So that was the Bush administration?
Yeah. And that was it. And you know, Marshall Islands also went through new administrations, and there was never any additional effort after that. There was no formal response from Congress. There's some question about whether the US needed to, or the Congress had to respond. In my mind, yes, it's logical. If I petition you, you respond to my petition. Maybe that's not always, I don't know, people have different views about that. So that was the 177 agreement that allowed that petition to take place. So let's talk about the tribunal, which was part of that agreement in the establishment of the Nuclear Claims Tribunal, which set up by mutual agreement between these two governments to handle all claims of damages from nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. So this tribunal is set up in the Marshalls. Tribunal judges are hired, fully staffed, and they start to receive claims. And they are claims of personal injury and property damage. So the tribunal modeled its structure for compensation largely after the Downwinders Act in the US. So it followed a lot of that precedent for claims and eligibility for claims and how claims would be handled based on the Downwinders Act.
What's the Downwinders Act?
So that was the US law that recognized people affected by the Nevada tests in those surrounding states as a compensation structure. So the tribunal starts to receive personal injury claims. It starts to develop a list of illnesses that are compensable, and that list changes over time. I mean, I'm kind of probably not doing enough justice to this history, but I'm trying to kind of put this in a nutshell.
This is the Spark Notes over all of the Runit Dome, so it's okay.
So yeah, this is just scratching the surface of this history. So the tribunal is hearing these petitions for personal injury claims and issuing awards, different monetary damage awards for different illnesses to all these people from throughout the Marshall Islands, not just limited to the 4 atolls. So the tribunal adopted a more nationwide approach, and it starts to hear property damage claims. And the first one it hears is from the people of Eniwetok. And that was decided before the changed circumstances petition in 2000. So they issue this property damage award to Eniwetok, which includes 3 components. One is hardship, one is loss of use, and the other is, no, I'm blanking. Oh, it's cleanup. It's the award for literal environmental cleanup. Yeah, it's using topsoil removing technologies, things like that. So these are the components, the main components of the award. And then it hears the petition from Bikini Atoll, Utrecht, and these are all big awards. They're in the several hundreds of millions. I think Utrecht's was the smallest. And then Rongelap comes last, and the award is about just over 1 billion. So you have all of these awards, but none of them can get paid in full because the tribunal has run out of funds. So the initial funding to the tribunal in the 1986 compact was 150 million. And it was to be invested and then produce an annual return at a certain level that was deemed to be sufficient to address future claims, past and future claims. Okay, but then you had a market crash that nobody thought about. And, the investments don't pan out the way they're meant to. But not only that, you have a volume of claims for a level of need that no one anticipated when 150 million was agreed to. But because you had the changed circumstances provision that allowed you an opportunity to make a case for additional funding based on new information, I'm walking through what I think our leaders were thinking at the time. It's simplistic because there were other issues there. There were other issues about sovereignty versus remaining as a trusteeship or joining the rest of Micronesia. Those were all other issues going on at the same time as well. But okay, so let's just break it down and be a little simplistic about this. You take the 150 million, you don't really know what it's going to cost. You don't know what you're going to deal with. But just in case, you've got this provision that'll allow you to up the amount if you find that it's not enough. Only that provision didn't work. And the amount was manifestly inadequate. So you've got all these personal injury claims that have never been able to be paid 100% in full. All of them were paid at varying levels, different percentage levels. No one got their full amount. And a lot of people died before they got anything. And then you have the property damage claims of huge numbers with only very small amounts being paid. And each one received some payment, but very small. So that's the tribunal situation. So the tribunal runs out of funds in 2009 and then basically ceases to operate a few years later. Officially, we never really shut it down. However, it is not a functioning office. The Nuclear Commission has taken custody of the files. All of the files have been digitized in their archives, 2 separate archives. But that is unfinished business in a really big way. Capital U, that is really unfinished business. You have people, like we were talking earlier about how all these decisions were being made in the 40s and, US leadership are making decisions that maybe they don't know the full extent of the impact. Marshallese are accepting what they're being told because nobody knows for sure. There's a lot of uncertainty. Now we know a lot, and we maybe know most of what we need to know, except there are still classified documents, so there's still a lot of information that's not known to us, but we know a lot more now. And we know how bad it is. And you can make that right. You can compensate people for the loss they continue to experience today, for the people who continue to be dislocated from their islands where their ancestors lived, and that's part of them. You can compensate people, and you can make it right for people who are sick and have to be dislocated again to get treatment overseas. But it's like, that's what we're dealing with. So, okay, maybe we didn't know what happened then, but we know what happens now, and we know here's one way you can fix it. And even, and that is still just this almost impossible reach. It's actually the subject of ongoing and current discussions that we're having right now with the US. So I can't go into too much detail on that. But that is why the Nuclear Commission was established, was to address these outstanding issues. There are many forms of justice, and we held dozens of meetings with stakeholders over a year and a half because we were developing a strategy. That was our main task. And justice comes in a lot of forms. It's knowledge, it's education about the history and empowerment, it's access to healthcare, and it's compensation. No question, compensation is probably universally the biggest form and maybe the best form in a lot of ways, because we're also, cash is king. Compensation. And when you're wronged, you get compensated. These are normal constructs now that we have in the world. When you do something bad to somebody, you compensate them somehow, and nobody's going to turn down money. But when you've got these huge awards sitting there and they're not being paid, and you're thinking, but that's what I'm owed, that's what I deserve. I mean, it is that simple. Take away all the other things about what we know or what we think, all the damage we think money can do to us and how money ruins us and all that. Take away all of that. The fact is, you were wronged, you were awarded a judgment for that wrong, but that has never been implemented, and not at any fault of your own. And you have very little power to make it happen. So I should probably stop talking about that, because like I said, it's the subject of some discussions we're having right now between our governments, and it's very political, it's sensitive for sure. But that is essentially where we are at this point. When we're talking about outstanding issues, a lot of it comes down to righting that wrong through fair compensation to people who suffered the damages, who sacrificed unknowingly, so that the US could reign supreme in this particular military technology. So yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah. I was having a conversation once with a really old friend of mine. And he's very religious. I'm not religious. And we were talking about money, and I was like, Dave, how do you reconcile money with religion? And he said something to me that I honestly think about a lot. And he goes, money is freedom. And it's not that I want money, it's that I want safety and freedom. And I'm accepting the game. And he said it to me like this. He said, I'm accepting the game, and the game is you need money for freedom and safety. So I don't think there's a sum in the world that is worth a pound of flesh, but it is definitely going to get you the freedom to be able to live a different life than you are now, according to, given the fact that you've lost that pound of flesh. So if it's building hospitals and care facilities, or it's building shelter to be able to withstand increasing threat of storms, or sea level rise, or any number of things that you are now facing, let alone what you're also facing because of the immense suffering that is put onto you in order to have a scientific experiment literally run in your, I don't want to say backyard because it seems like it diminishes it. It's your ancestral land. And I honestly believe that one of the big increases of depression these days is not just because of capitalism and consumerism and, the worship of false idols, but I also think it's because we don't have an access to tradition and any type of ancestral tie to anything anymore. So to have that ripped away from you in such a jarring way, that is literally the light of the sun that did it, and then now having to live with, the 70 years of fallout since then, let alone the 100 years before that was also more imperial suffering, just in a different color of a banner. Yes, I think, and to your comment earlier of in 2006, should Congress have responded? You're damn right they should have responded. I'm pretty upset that they didn't, because this is manifestly inadequate. I think is a great legal term to say, like, what the hell were you thinking, and this isn't right. We now understand what we got ourselves into. And you the game you agreed to, which is, we're going to agree to this compact, we're going to agree by play by your rules, and you did that, without realizing the stakes in which you were up against. And now that there is there, I think you have every right to to have that compact changed, and quite starkly, let alone the fact that you played, like, again, you played by those rules, you went through the tribunals, which could not have been easy for anyone who had to be going through that, let alone, what they were dealing with in their own personal lives, to then say, well, wait, hold on a second, I played by your rules, and your rules told me I'm supposed to get this, and what do you mean I don't get this? This is just another example of trusting something, and kind of having the ground taken out from underneath you. So I wish you, I don't want to ask you any more questions. I don't want to get you into anything with the negotiations that are happening now, but I wish you all the luck with that, because I think it's about damn time that something was done.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I want to ask a question about the Runit Dome. So it is the dome itself a concern? Like, is the containing of the material that's in there a concern? And the reason I'm asking that is, if there is so much of the radioactive material is not actually being housed in that, how much is the islands themselves a concern versus how much the material that's in it? Because I'm asking this to follow it up with a second question.
Yeah, it's definitely a concern for the community who are living nearby, and just not knowing what the cumulative impact would be of having that chronic exposure to that radioactive waste that's just not far away from them. We have only had DOE studies to rely on. We've never had an independent study to the extent that DOE has studied the island. So we also have a public trust issue. So what I'm telling you is based on the DOE data, but I should also let you know that most people don't trust it. So while the DOE data is showing that uptakes of cesium-137 is typically the main pathway is through food, comes in through food crops. So there's whole body counters in the Marshall Islands. There's one in Madro, in the capital, and I believe there's one in Eniwetok too. DOE data from the whole body counters is saying that cesium levels are low. But for me, what's missing from that is how much of the diet is still based on local food. And it's not very much. And there's a reason for that, because it's not safe. So I think there's parts of the story that are not connecting in ways that are giving people enough comfort that the risk isn't bigger than it is. The containment itself of by the dome, yeah, I mean, when most of the radiation is outside the dome, then it does in a way make the threat of the dome breaking apart less scary, because it's already out there. But I think that's just, it's a piece of a much bigger puzzle, or a much bigger picture there. You still don't want that dome breaking apart. And DOE tells us that maybe in an extreme weather event, it's possible there could be some cracking or some breaking. I mean, we don't know. I think it's lasted for a long time. There's definitely groundwater mixing with the lagoon water under the dome. And there's a plutonium fingerprint there, but they don't know how much of it is, like I said, from the dome itself or already in the lagoon. We're just really lacking independent review. And that's an effort we've been taking up since the Nuclear Commission was started. We can identify independent scientists and groups to come and do the work, but funding it is a completely different story. It turns out that when you're a strong military partner with the US, you don't want to fund these radiation studies in the Marshall Islands. You don't want to touch that. So we're still on the hunt for some funding sources to help us get the study done, because it will be incredibly technical and resource intensive, because we're talking about deep core drilling in the lagoon floor and a lot of laboratory work over a period of time.
Yeah. So here comes my second part of the question. How much is the shifting climatic events that we're experiencing? So by that being more intense weather, as well as a rising sea, right? Which you're gonna correct me, I hope, if I'm wrong here. I think that the high tides are getting higher there, right? And I don't know what it's called there. I had it written down. In San Diego, we call it the king tide, where every once like a week out of every year we get a king tide. So it's like extremely high. And I know that here the locals are rather naive. They don't realize how much higher it's getting. But I don't believe an island nation such as yourself would be in such a place. So my question is, how much are the shifting patterns of the climate vis-a-vis more intense storms, as well as higher extreme tides? How are they affecting all of these atolls? And maybe we can even just say the Runit Dome itself, because I would imagine, that sediment probably would stay in the lagoon if it's, near sea level or still considered a lagoon. But if, the sea level rises a meter, it's no longer a lagoon. It's just a low-lying body of water now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we have king tides too, and they are more frequent. And being low-lying atolls, sea level rise is a daily thought for many. But yeah, so rising sea levels around the Runit Dome will definitely increase the mixing in the groundwater in the lagoon. But like you just said, a lot of it will probably settle in the lagoon floor in the sediment. And again, most of it's already in the lagoon. So I think what we would see is something, because we could see it happening, that's what makes it feel so scary and I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, but in terms of its impact for radiation, I think it would still be relatively small based on the DOE data. But regardless, you still don't want this dome breaking apart necessarily. I read a headline recently, and I didn't have a chance to go back to the article yet, that some scientific studies are showing that some of the islands are actually rising or gaining more land. So I think we need to keep that in mind. It might just be one study, but climate change and sea level rise in the Marshall Islands, that discussion is focused on adaptation and how best to protect the islands from being completely inundated. So these are things like seawall and landfill, major infrastructure development type projects and discussions that are extremely expensive. But that's the climate change discussion. Yes, Runit is part of that. Yes, the nuclear legacy is part of that, in as much as the overlap is on displacement, forced displacement. But the focus is really on how to protect all of the islands so that people don't have to leave. And then I would say that radiation in Runit is a secondary concern, but not secondary in a not important way. Just, forefront of mind is protecting all of the islands through adaptation techniques and projects.
I've put it this way before on the show. It's in transforming it to the situation. It's sea level rise is the barbarians at the gates, and the walls are still falling down, but we got to deal with the barbarians at the gates first.
Mm-hmm. Good analogy. Mm-hmm.
I'm stealing it from J.M. Coates. He has a great book, Waiting on the Barbarians.
Okay.
It's it's worth checking out because it's a challenge to imperialism. That's the whole premise of the book, actually. Um, that's I'm going to be thinking. I try my best to keep conversations flowing in these when I do these, and I just let myself unpack them later on walks with my dog. But I'm telling you right now, I'm going to be very emotional thinking about two of the things that you said. One of them was the thinking it was snow, and the second one is the fact that sea level rise is a daily thought. Because I talked with Dr. Heiko Balser. He's a professor at the University of Leicester, and he uses satellites to map the Earth. And I said something to him, and I was really hoping for him to correct me, but he didn't. He actually expanded on it. And I said, the permafrost melting keeps me up at night. And sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I get really worried because I don't think people realize that sea level rise is a really big problem. And I think, coming from the States, we live in a continent. And I think that that's something that gets taken for granted. The manifest destiny that was sold to us, or at least some of the people that were here, was that we were going to conquer a continent. And I think that insulates us from a lot of these thoughts. Part of that is the fact that most of the world lives, I think it's like 52% of the world lives within 100 miles of the coast. So most people are going to be affected by this. But when we live in such an isolated area, in a sense of, not in the sense you're isolated, you're truly isolated in the middle of an ocean. We're isolated because we have so much resource and might, and in the way we architect the rest of the world, that we're insulated from a lot of it. But the truth is that this is a daily problem that we're not seeing yet. In a lot of the ways that these testing and the legacy is a daily problem, but now kind of the fallout of the effect of the world and kind of the the word I almost want to use is, I'm going to say this sarcastically, but the world peace that was brought from nuclear weapons has brought a legacy which now is bringing sea level rise to your door again. So from the deepest part of my heart, I'm so sorry this is happening. This is really tragic and very frustrating for me to understand, because this is it's unfortunate, and I hope that more light gets shined on this. I'm happy that you're doing this. I'm really happy about this. I'm very happy that the Nuclear Commission has got off the ground, and you guys have been going through this, because this is it's clearly not going to go away, right? And it's better to tackle it now than and get as much out there as you can than more kind of happening. And I hope that it doesn't, with your current talks, it doesn't get silenced, and with more of these barbarians coming to the gates and more of these bills that we wrote come due, I hope that you're definitely getting the attention that you deserve, especially in this particular instance.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right. I mean, here we are facing another problem, not of our own doing, but it's an existential threat yet again. But I will say that, Marshallese, and I think island people in general, we're survivors. You said earlier, these atolls, these are rough environments, and atolls are the oldest geological structures. Marshallese, my ancestors came to these islands hundreds of years ago and survived and thrived. I think that was the word you said. So there's definitely some victimization as a result of these events that are beyond our control. But ultimately, I think island peoples are survivors. And, inevitably, who knows what's going to happen? And hopefully it's not as dire as our predictions show. I'm not that optimistic, but I will keep a space for hope in there in my brain somewhere, that the islands won't cease to exist. I hope that it will never be the case, but it won't just be us. We will not be the only ones who are, if these predictions, the worst of them come true, we won't be the only ones that become historical memories. I mean, Manhattan Island is going to be underwater too. So, and many islands in the Pacific and other areas of the world, climate change comes in a lot of forms, not just sea level rise. So I guess I say that just to make myself feel a little bit better that we're not in this alone, we're not fighting this alone, and that you know, with everyone working on solutions, or in our case, adaptation techniques, because we're not the polluters, we're not the creators, but I just have faith in innovation and technology. And you know, if you can see islands, whole islands being built in China and Dubai, why can't we reinforce ours? We know we can. It's a cost thing, but are we really going to let entire countries just cease to exist if we have ways to stop that? I have more faith in humanity, and I hope I don't eat those words, or that my daughter or her children don't have to, you know, fight that same sentiment, because it's so pessimistic. But I can't believe or accept that the absolute worst will happen when there are ways to prevent it or ways around it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's making me think about your answer to happiness in the beginning, and your answer was I'm content, and I appreciate that. You know, there was a conversation I had with a different guest, and the line of thought that we kind of landed on is this is the worst time that all of these conundrums can be happening at once because of the convergence of them all. But at the same time, this is the best time it ever could have happened because of the interconnectivity of us and the access to information. And something else I've mentioned before is I try not to believe in hope, which sounds like a little bit of hyperbolic. But what I mean by that is if you hope something is or isn't going to happen, it's a bit of a passive act. Where if you build faith, it's an active thing, and you can start building and moving towards something. And I think if a lot of what you just said right there is you're building faith, and you know, if we can do this, if you know the Chinese and the South China Sea can all of a sudden just sprout up whole airfields out of nothing but water, you know, why can't we do something here? You know, and if there's other places in the world that are having this happen to, why can't we share that knowledge of what they're doing and whatnot, and be able to bring that here? And no, and I think that that's really the truth of it. It's, you know, when we face something that is as large and existential as this, we can either, to steal from J.M. Coates again, we can either point a finger and create a barbarian and create something as an other, or we can point it back inwards and say, well, what the hell are we going to do about it then? And I think that there's a lot of, in this conversation, I have a lot of faith in being able to do that. And both from what you all are doing there and recognizing it, because I think one of the things that I get frustrated, at least, you know, in American politics, is how much we're unwilling to just even have the conversation for a lot of things. And I say that on both sides of the aisle. You know, we're not willing to have the conversation where, you know, my only fear is that it's going to be to the point where it's going to be a lot more costly than it would have been otherwise. But I think with, you know, individuals such as yourself taking the time to, you know, express this and having it be your work, you know, to do this, it's the tip of the spear. And I think that it is going to build faith, and it is going to build a better future. Cause I think we can, like, I think to that point again, I think, you know, at no point in time could we ever have a species take over the world and fuck it up, but we can never have another species that could take over the world and make it better than it's ever been. Right. So, I think both of those things are true. Thank you. I'm going to leave this conversation in a few minutes a lot more energized than I did before. So thank you for doing that. I want to ask another question about the Runit Dome. And that's, in the LA Times article, they pointed out that it wasn't just waste from the atoll that was collected there. It was also imported waste. Is that the case? Is that also the case?
This is the soil brought in from Nevada?
Yes.
Yeah, that most of the information on that was new to us. There was soil, I think it was 120, 130 tons of soil brought in from Nevada to, well, to do what? We're not entirely sure. I think to cover up the failed test. I know that DOE claims that it was clean soil from Nevada, not from a testing site. But again, I think when we're talking about radiation around any testing site, we have to use these terms clean and safe. relatively. I think what's more concerning is that the leadership, the Inuitak leadership, were not fully aware of that soil. It is in a report. It's buried in a 1982, I think it's a DOD or Atomic Energy Commission report. Right there in the middle of all the scientific speak that you got to be a scientist or a PhD to understand. But I think what it points to is the larger problem of key information not being readily accessible and easily available to either communities, decision makers, landowners, to be able to understand what they're living with or living nearby, or what actually took place on their islands. So, and I don't think we could put our hand on our heart and say we never knew about this, because it's there. But it just speaks to a larger systemic issue with this whole history of information being inaccessible to the people who need it the most.
That makes
Which
sense.
is a form of justice, information, because it empowers you to make decisions and to understand your surroundings and the risks in your environment, and just,
Knowledge is power, right? It seems like a cliche, but the truth
true.
behind that cliche is the fact that with the knowledge and understanding of, I mean, it goes back to, the story about your mother, like she didn't have any knowledge of the fact of who these people were and what they were doing there, right? She was just startled by this new type of person that I haven't seen before, right? And then the fallout, like even the concept of fallout is a new understanding, right? Like even like the Fallout Act or the Downwind Act, that wasn't, I know when they were doing the nuclear tests in Nevada, the first couple of ones, they weren't aware of fallout, of what it was, or how to deal with it. So somebody, who just all of a sudden had an explosion happen a few days ago isn't going to understand it. And the knowledge of what to do with that is, well, maybe in 1986, when you're signing this accord, all of a sudden it's going to be a little bit different, right? So to continue to kind of find information, it begs the question of what else isn't in there. So like going back to knowledge and information, is flooding you with the amount of information that you have to sift through that's unclassified is one thing, which is one way of suppressing knowledge, is I'm going to overload you with things to go through. And then the second one is I'm going to withhold. So it begs the question of what's in the information that you have, but you know what I mean? You have to sift through intentional jargon, or just having it be one line of a footnote. You know what I mean? That if somebody didn't have enough coffee when they were reading, perhaps they'd kind of glance over, right? And then also what's in the correspondence that's sealed. This is a web of conundrums that I honestly can't believe isn't getting much attention. I know there was that New York or LA Times article in 2018, and then it was like, I know there was like a flash in the pan for a few days of that, and then it kind of went out of the news. So you're currently in talks right now to re-up this agreement, and that's happening even with COVID and all of that. And changes of administration and all of that, that's still ongoing.
Yeah, it's actually the economic provisions of the compact are expiring in 2023, so we're just starting discussions on those now. The entire agreement itself is not expiring. But back to your point about information and how the story came out in the LA Times and then it's kind of died down a bit. That story had the highest readership in Washington, D.C. of any other LA Times story in 2019. So that was a really promising statistic for us, because that meant that people were being educated. And that's why the information is so important, because if you don't understand what's happening, and you can't tell the story, and then you can't do anything about whatever's still left to be done. But our education begins with ourselves. So we're putting a lot of effort into our national school curriculum, and educating our young people and the next generation. and we hire interns to work with the commission, because we need more Marshallese to know and understand our history, because these are issues that will be going on for a very long time. And if you don't get the information out there where people can understand it and know it, inherently know it and understand it, then that history will die. And that's true for any story, anyone's history. But that's also why that digitization project and the archive project of the tribunal was so important. And I cannot stress enough how critical that was. And I came into the commission at a time when that project was just being finished up. And I didn't have enough appreciation for it at the time, but I certainly have it now. To have those records archived and safe, that's our body of evidence. That's not just our history, that's our body of evidence. That is proof that these things happened, and this is how bad it was, and this is what was done and what was not done. I mean, it's all the tribunal records and references and notes, and under a very carefully guarded system. They're sitting in the Swiss Federal Archives and the city of Girona, Spain, Municipal Archives. So they're divided. Videos, audio, and paper files. But that is the foundation of making sure that we reach some level of justice, however that's defined by the individual, for the impact of this legacy that we will always have. It's that information. So I completely agree with you that the more information we can get that is distilled into terms and in forms that the everyday person can understand and use, the better off we'll all be. We still have a ways to go. There's a lot of scientific reporting out there that is intentionally full of jargon that is very difficult to get through and process.
Yeah. And, as I think Chernobyl, like there's a Netflix show or something like that got very popular. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that people took away from with that is what a half-life is. So the amount of time that, a nuclear detonation needs in order for half of the amount of radiation to decay to a point where it's half of what it was there is incredibly long. So for, as long as, your people have been in these islands is quite possibly even longer the legacy that these detonations are going to have there. So I think understanding that, to your point, understanding it and reconciling it it is going to be the legacy of, I mean, it's unfortunate, but it really is going to be the legacy of a lot of the Marshallese for a long time to come. And I'm happy to hear that the commission is together. I'm happy to hear that those are digitized. And thank you for taking the time to talk with me, because I think this is another means of doing what you just said, of trying to find this into, a narrative that is as easy to get somebody started, right? Like this isn't the whole story. This isn't, everything, but this is at least a way that I hope people are shocked into looking this up more, because this is an incredible legacy to have to contend with, and let alone everything else. I mean, globalization itself is its own set of conundrums, which when we were on the phone talking last, we're chatting about of, what diets change and how that affects people, and, importing food or having more processed foods and what that kind of the conundrums that brings, let alone also having all of this. And, I think really the time we live in is the convergence of conundrums to try to figure out a way to sort it all out. So, we can wrap in a second, and I would love to chat with you for a second before I let you go. But thank you again for taking the time. This is an incredible story, and I don't mean that incredible in a good way, but incredible in a way of I can't believe this all happened, and quite to the depth of it that it did. And thank you very much for the time. I'd love to have you on again to kind of dive into some more of these things, and also to I would love to keep chatting and seeing how the Accords are going, and if there's anything I can do with this humble podcast or anything in my career for where this takes me or anything else goes, I'm not going to forget about this. And I really want to do whatever it is I can, because this is an incredible scar that we have to contend with, I think, as a world.
I appreciate that. Thank you for the opportunity to share our story, because like I said, it isn't in the mainstream. So we look forward to the opportunities, and I'm grateful that you've given me so much time today to share just a little bit. Like you said, there's so much more to the story, and maybe we'll find time another time to continue, but I really hope that people will go and look into a bit more and understand the contributions that the Marshall Islands have made essentially to world peace at a time when things were extremely unstable in the world.
That's a great point. Well, thank you very much.